in the caucus, we know at times bills pass out and need further work when they move to the floor. So you shouldn't have an expectation that every bill that obviously moved out this week is in its final form. We're still actively working on several pieces of legislation. But that being said, some of the priorities that we've continued to talk about during this time that moves through committee this week, one of them being that I'm sure you'll either ask about or I'll be asked about at some point in the near future, would be on the pipeline legislation. Obviously, we moved a bill forward that we feel is a very reasonable approach. You've seen other bills filed so far this session that would just outlaw the ability to use pipelines for CO2. We felt the bill that about 22 of us signed on to, me included, was a reasonable approach to try to allow to put some onus on the companies to reach a certain threshold before they can use eminent domain to make sure we're protecting private property rights in the process, but not at the same time saying you can't do it, because there's a two-way street to private property rights in our opinion, and we feel our bill strikes a good balance on that. So I just wanted to touch on that because I'm sure you were going to ask, and that's good for my district to make sure they hear that we pass that out. So
could you just go ahead? Sorry, go ahead.
Democratic leaders are saying that was just this kind of flurry of anti-LGBT bills that are moving through the legislature. It seems like Republicans are thinking that gay marriage and transgender children are the biggest problems facing the state. What would you say to that?
Well, to the part of that question that you asked, I'm not sure if this is the question you asked. I'll try to answer it best I can. But when it comes to the marriage bill, there was multiple marriage bills filed in the legislature, not just by Republicans but Democrats as well, that were assigned this week. But I would also, and those are not moving through the process, any of them from both sides. But I would also say we laid out in session very early on some of these bills being part of our priority list. So I wouldn't say that this is a flurry of things just coming along right now because we're at funnel. And keep in mind, a lot of the bills that we're working on, we're taking concerns from Iowans across the state and trying to figure out on how we have best policies to make sure that it works as well as possible. I've had this conversation with many superintendents about, well, we're not doing this. We know that school is, we know we're not doing it, so why are we being lumped into it? And that's the problem we find ourselves in as a legislature, is we understand not every school is doing some of the things that we're trying to address. But when you have some that are actively it puts us in a position where we have to react to our constituents. So I wouldn't say that this is something, these are issues we've been talking about that were filed the first week of session, several of these bills that we're talking about right now. I think we look at that issue is looked at very differently from the standpoint of you're looking at a situation when many of these types of cares are permanent things that have impacts that we don't know. Number one, the impacts in most cases, are not reversible. So, we have laws on the books in the state all the time that don't allow parents to say, well, the law says it, but we get parental consent. I mean, this is something that we feel very strongly about. We were actually, I'll be honest with you, part of why we are here where we are today is I was surprised to find out that some of our major healthcare providers in the state were actually doing this when we inquired about it. I think there was a level of surprise amongst the members of our caucus, and so it puts us in a position where we want to bring some common sense to this conversation. I've talked to a lot of people back home, and I know a lot of our members have, that see this as something that when I tell them, they didn't believe it until we started having hearings and getting responses back from some of these providers. So we feel very strongly about our position that we're taking on this issue. And when it comes to the other ones, I don't know why. Let's look at the other bills, and I'm not trying to take away from the questions that are being asked, but I think that we've had a theme here with two of them that have now been asked. Let's just look at parental notification. One of our bills that we have right now, I can't remember the House file number that it was originally signed, but while that bill, yes, we want to make sure the parents understand what's actually going on with their student. I don't see how we should have a system where school districts feel that that is what's best from the student, keeping that information from the parents. I look at that as that's a perfect example of something that we're doing that, in my opinion, those are two totally separate issues that when you have life events like that happening at schools, that information should be shared with the parents. So we don't see surgeries and some of these hormone therapies and puberty blockers as the same type of issue as something that would be going on in our school systems.
A quick follow-up to that. You say you're hearing about this from your constituents. We heard from doctors last week, and many medical associations say that this care is recommended for transgender kids. So, are you talking to medical experts on this that recommend not to do it?
Well, I would also say that, again, I don't know if we can sit here and say, well, when we're talking, and remember, we're talking about minors, and that's why we were specific in this, because we believe that, we're putting these kids in a situation where this has long-term impacts that we do not know if it's even reversible, what those look like 10, 20 years down the road. That's why we focused on minors for this conversation, because you're really asking a lot of that child, whatever they are, whether it's 13, 14, 16, 10, whatever it is. That's a major life decision that's happening right now, and that's why you said for minors, we don't think that should be applicable. That's why we did not go beyond into any of the adult ages.
But when you say we don't know, the healthcare experts say they do know, and the parents and the children at that point do know all that goes into that, and they know what the repercussions are.
I would say that it's very difficult for us to say that it's settled science that we know the long-term impacts of having any of these kinds of treatments on anyone that's a youth. And here's where I will say on this issue, I will err on the side of caution when it comes to the minors within the state. Again, that's why we did not go past an adult. If that's a decision you want to make. But if I'm going to err on one side of this, I want to make sure we're erring to protect the children.
Well, and I don't want to take up the whole press conference, but there's caution in passing this law too, right?
Yep,
And that's why you've been here. So
I understand that there's differing of opinion what that long-term solution and what the best practice would be. However, I would say, from my perspective and many members of the caucus, we are going to err on the side of caution when it comes to protecting these minors. So.
Well, then what about